Good afternoon. It is time to spill the tea with Dr. P. And y'all see, I got my tea here too. I got some good tea. One of my good friends bought me some tea for my birthday because they know I really like tea. So even though this show is called Spilling the Tea, it's not just about giving information. I really drink tea here. So anyhow, I am Dr. Linnell Plummer, the CEO of Onyx Therapy Group. Super excited that you guys are joining us today as we have a range of conversations with one of my most favorite people, Dr. Robinson. I was introduced to her a few years back through the Maryland Counseling Association and have been following her and loving all the things that she's been doing since then. She's also guest lectured in one of my classes at Johns Hopkins. We are planning a time to hang out. We've been trying, y'all, to hang out. And these schedules, when you hear about her, you're going to be like, I understand, because she is full and busy with purpose. And I absolutely love it. So thank you so much for joining us today for our November Spilling the Tea. So, Dr. Robinson, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor. Clinically, I specialize in grief and loss. I have a group practice in Bethesda, Maryland with an amazing team. When I'm not doing that, I am an income strategist for mental health professionals. And so I help them launch scale clinical practice, but also I love that beyond the couch, I call them global leaders, because wherever there are people, we are needed. And so really helping us be in those spaces, show up in our zone of genius and build generational wealth is what I do. I'm a corporate consultant, and international speaker and author. So those are some of the things that I do. I think I try and keep this brief. You don't realize all the things you do until somebody tells you to talk about yourself.
Right, exactly. And a mom, right? Like, we're
Oh,
going to talk about that a little bit about
yes.
how all this works. But see, I told you guys, Dr. Robinson has a full plate, and I am glad that she came and spent some time with us today. I want to kind of start off with I wrote a couple notes down, especially about what you just said around generational wealth. So I think I want to touch on that a little bit today, too. But I want to start with being a businesswoman. So you are a businesswoman. In fact, one of the first times I saw you speaking, you were doing a session on entrepreneurship. And of course, also a businesswoman in mental health. I was extremely intrigued with everything that you had to say because, as therapists, we are not trained to be in business, but many people want to have a private practice or a group practice or some sort of mental health company. Tell me a little bit about how you got started as a businesswoman.
Yeah, so my career in business started working in corporate America. So I have a bachelor's in business, I have an MBA. I was an income strategist for Fortune 500 companies like Nestle and Pfizer and Macy's. And so what I did there was literally just make them more money. And so my responsibility was to build profitable partnerships between different organizations. My most lucrative deal was, brokering a larger partnership between Nestle and Walmart, right? So big
Nice.
responsibility, right? And so I took just all of that information and leveraged that in building my own practice. It really was um, understanding that the 9 to 5, repetitive piece was not for me. I felt like I was missing a lot of my daughter's life because I was constantly working. When you're salaried, you don't just work 40 hours, right?
Right.
And you
That's
have
right.
the level of responsibility of a multi-billion-dollar account. You do not work 9 to 5. It's just
Right.
what it is, right? And recognizing how much I didn't really want to miss. I wanted that freedom. And so I
Yeah.
initially negotiated to be a corporate consultant and just do income strategy for them, which is what allowed me to do my PhD full time and
Okay.
still do that. So I switched to being a contractor. And for a long time, my daughter didn't think I had a job because I'd gotten so good at only working when she was at school or asleep. And I was like, oh no, she needs the full narrative of understanding how hard mom is out here working, right? But I had accomplished my goal of making sure that our home life wasn't interrupted or it wasn't trumped by the things I had to do professionally. And
Yes.
so I got to a place even through academia or just working in hospitals and agencies where I was burnt out. And I knew that I still wanted to serve, but I couldn't make any less money because our lifestyle was, mama having a corporate salary, right? And a
Right.
commission. And I knew that I was called to do grief work. And I couldn't do that 40 hours a week and keep myself whole. And
Right.
so going into private practice allowed me the flexibility to serve while securing financial stability for myself and my daughter. And so that's really what led me into that space, is because I knew that I was going to get fired from corporate if I didn't do something different, right? Because my priorities had changed, really making sure that I wasn't missing out on her life and that I was not sacrificing and sabotaging my own sense of self.
Yeah.
And I really was beginning to feel disconnected from making multi-billion-dollar organizations millions of more dollars.
Right.
That didn't feel in alignment with the way that I was called to serve and who I was called to serve.
Right.
And so that led me to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting, because when we think about entrepreneurship and mental health, there's so many different reasons why we go into that route. So many reasons why people go into entrepreneurship in any industry, right? But especially in mental health. And I heard you say that a large part of yours was rooted in wanting to have a good balance between being a mom and also being a woman, right? You weren't just a machine, and sometimes corporate America requires us to be machine-like robots, right?
On all the time.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
all the time. But then there's also this idea that it's not a 9 to 5, and the 9 to 5 becomes too much, or you're working more than 9 to 5, right? But as an entrepreneur, we work more than general 9 to 5 hours also. It just looks a little different. It may be answering an email that's really important or jumping on a call, and that extra hours is built around other things, administrative or partnerships and things.
Yeah. And, I really want to kind of disrupt this piece, right? Because so many of us leave 9 to 5s to enter into private practice or entrepreneurship and end up working what looks like 24/7. And a big piece of that is because we have a lot of scarcity around outsourcing and delegating, or we treat it as if we're the only person that can do it well.
Yeah.
Or we think that we say things like, I can't afford to hire, I'll just do it myself, as if our labor is free.
Right.
We're working and our time is valuable. Anytime we're doing things that are out of our zone of genius that are necessary, but that don't require us, it literally costs us the time and the creativity and energy we need to actually do the things that the business needs from us specifically.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big thing that is a big difference that I see therapists have more often than I see some other industries who are not service-based, right?
Right.
Something in our training that conditions us to be therapists first and business owners second. And we have to do the reverse. You're a business owner who happens to be a therapist if you want to have a successful, sustainable business, whatever success means to you, right? Otherwise, it's a high cost hobby. And so I think we have to shift our mindset regarding that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I really drive home to my students at Hopkins too for my entrepreneurship class. And I really talk to them about how much it costs to say have somebody do one of the things that we want to do. Say for instance, our accountant, right? Like how much does it cost a month, and how much does that month cost a day, or even by an hour? And then compare that to how much you make an hour, right? If you see a client, how much are you making? Is the accountant being paid far less an hour than you are? If so, it means that you need to go with the accountant, and then maybe you can see another client, or just free up that time so you have some peace, so that when you are ready to work, you can be more focused, right? So it's interesting that you said that, because we are trained as therapists first, and then and we don't usually get training as business people. You have a background in business, and I teach the course at Hopkins, but I didn't have a background in business either, right? So it is interesting when we think about how people become business owners just based off of being good in their or maybe not everybody not good, but just being in their industry.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. So tell me real quick, what are a couple quick lessons from the start of your business to now? A couple quick lessons that you learned, because you're going to continue to grow and be dynamic, right?
That's right.
From the start to now, what are maybe 2 lessons that you've learned that you'd be wanting other business owners to kind of think about and know?
Yeah, I think one of the important things that I've learned is to hire well. And so hire based on not only their skill set, but on their values. Do they value the core mission of your business? And I think that's especially important as clinicians, because if you hire someone that's a good medical receptionist that can, they're the first point of contact for clients, but they have underlying beliefs about therapy, right? They are promoting stigma around therapy, and they're not coachable around that. They are the first interaction and can unintentionally do harm for people who it's already hard enough to call in and ask for help, right? So that piece is important. And so around that, what's the queen bee role, right? The queen bee role for every member of my team is that whomever we encounter must feel seen, heard, and cared for. And if the policy doesn't align with that, we need to reevaluate the policy. Whether we can help them or we're connecting them to someone else in the community, they will leave us feeling seen, heard, and cared for, from our biller to our admin to me. We all have that responsibility. And that piece is super important, because I can train anyone to do the job, but I cannot retrain someone's kind of values, right? And their belief systems, and whether or not they believe everyone is deserving of kindness and care, right? And so that I find to be super important. So the hiring well, and I would have hired sooner along those lines. That would be number one. And then number two, I think that it's critical, and this is one that I have going into chapter 10 or year 10 in my practice, is I think that we need to go into our businesses having a plan to exit. And one of the reasons that that's so critical is that we will exit our businesses voluntarily or involuntarily, right? And we have a responsibility ethically and legally that there's a continuity plan. And if you're like me, I want to not only exit, I want to exit rich, right? And I mean that not only from a monetary perspective, but from an impact perspective. If my business closes today or tomorrow, I am confident in the impact that we have had and the impact that we will leave, as well as the generational wealth I have created for myself and for every member of my team, because that is something that I am committed to doing. But I also have a plan to exit my business and allow the business to still run, because that's what I desire. Some of us want to exit it and sell it or to close it, but we need to be thinking about that as we start the business. And I think that's very counter to those of us in this field, but it is best practice in most industries, right? You have an exit plan of some sort, whether it just be retirement or because you're incapacitated. That's a type of exit that may result in a re-entry, but it's still an exit. And so I think those on either end of the spectrum, from when I first started, the hiring well, to where I am now, the exit rich. I think that's it. And there's a book called Exit Rich I recommend everyone read, regardless of where you are in your journey.
Listen, I might get that book right now.
It is a phenomenal book.
Okay. So if you weren't doing business, specifically business and mental health, what would you be doing?
My husband asks me this question all the time. I just can't imagine myself not being either a therapist or helping other people, right? So I would be doing something helping. If I didn't have to worry about money and I knew that I could still help people, I would probably do more writing. I love writing retreats, right? And I love being able to read. So I would still be doing something that would give me access to be an educator of some sort. That's the one thing that I grieved when I left academia, was my identity as an educator, as a professor. But I have learned that, my territory as an educator continues to expand past the four walls of academia, right? Now I teach and train folks all over the world across demographics and age groups. And so that piece, I think, will always be a core part of who I am. So wherever I am, I'll be sharing and exchanging knowledge for the betterment of people.
You said sharing and exchanging. What do you get to learn? Because a lot of times when you're on at the top, right? You're the CEO or you're the professor, you're the mom, you're in whatever, you're the therapist. Tell me more about what you learn in life.
I think I intentionally try to be in spaces where people don't view me as competition, or I'm not always the smartest person in the room, because that gets uncomfortable real quick, right? And so I like finding and being in spaces where I'm not the subject matter expert. And so I think most of the things I learn really is about building community. And that's again a core part of who I am. I also learn a lot about just the different ways that other folks walk in the world.
Yeah.
And I think I have the capacity to be insulated because of the wealth that I've generated. And, I'm a Black woman with a PhD that puts me in like the 1% category here, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I find it very important to be with people and exchange information from folks that don't have formal education, because there's something that you lose when you have been trained in the systems that trained us, right?
Yes, that's right.
And I find that I'm constantly in a place of striving because of those things. And
Mm-hmm.
what I lost was a place of being. And so what I get to do that feels most fulfilling for me is just be with other people. And I learned about their cultures and their families and their narratives
Yeah.
and how they view the world in worlds that are no longer my spaces, ones that I've visited and I've been in at one place, but
Yeah.
that I'm no longer in. And for me, that keeps me grounded. It
Yeah.
also keeps me with a servant heart. And I think for
Yeah.
me, that's the most important. I tell anyone that ask me, right, about how I became so successful. Well, I can't answer that question first without talking about God, right? Because
Yeah.
that's just what it is. He's my CFO for
Yes.
sure, right?
Yes. Yes.
And my life coach. But the other piece is I've learned more from my grandmother, who has a third grade education, than I have from colleagues with PhDs and MBAs and all these other pieces,
Right.
because it's always been about people first, right?
Right.
About
Right.
serving others. I think those are the things that are a core part of who I am, that I can continue to learn about for the rest of my life.
Yeah. 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 Tell me about those beginnings. So you mentioned your grandmother. I think I can't remember where you and I were, and we were vibing hard about
Yeah,
these. Oh, we went to lunch. I
we
think we went to
did.
lunch one
We
day,
went to lunch.
and we were vibing hard about our childhoods and our upbringing and how those experiences kind of served as motivation.
Yeah.
Here's my thing, right? Most people will see me and they'll say, "Hey, this is Dr. Plummer. She has this degree. She lives over here. She does this. She does that." And it's as if I came out of the womb like this, right? As if there was not this beginning,
Yeah.
and or they see my dad, who has also pulled, who has been elevated, right?
Yes.
So he didn't do it alone. He has been elevated because that is his purpose in life, and they think that it just became this way for both of us. And I
Yeah.
battle sometimes, like, how much of the past do they really need to know, right? How much of the past is important so that they have greater context to who I am. And I'm still getting there. I think I'm learning that in different environments with different people, my intuition will tell me what needs to be shared and what doesn't need to be shared, right? But tell me a little bit
Absolutely.
about your beginnings, because right now what we hear is Dr. Robinson is a successful entrepreneur who is doing all of these wonderful things, corporate consultant, CEO, author, which we're going to get to in a minute. You keep talking about the generational wealth. And how did this start? How did you become Dr. Robinson?
So I became who I needed, right?
Okay,
So
okay.
um, I'm a trauma disruptor.
Mm-hmm.
That is a calling that I fought kicking and screaming, right? I always tell folks, listen, I tried everything I could to not be a grief and trauma therapist. I went to law school in between going for my PhD. I was fighting hard, right? But there was a calling on my life that it's just what it was. And when I accepted it, for me, that's where the peace and the joy and fulfillment really came.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that I couldn't do the work of bearing witness to the suffering, the growth, and the healing of others because I had never done my own work, right? And
Okay.
so I often will share that my ACEs score was an 8 out of 10 before I was 9. Right. And
Yeah,
for those of you that
right.
understand that, adverse childhood experiences. And so all of the things that you can imagine that could happen, right, from economic disparities, right, to parental incarceration, addiction, and divorce. And we talked briefly before we started this call about me having an artificial bone in my cheek. Well, that's not by happenstance.
Right, right,
Right?
right.
And so if we talk about the sheer cumulative nature of trauma,
Right.
starting at least the age of 2,
Yeah.
right? Through, and what we know is that if you have childhood trauma, you're more likely to have trauma throughout adulthood. That is
Yes.
especially true for Black women with
Yes.
intimate partner violence. you name it, right? There were, the data says that I would have, had a child in high school, would be on, state assistance, things of that nature. But because I'm a disruptor, that was not
Right.
so. So, being the first and the only in my family to hold a PhD.
Yeah.
I was the first in my line on either side to go to college.
Yeah.
I graduated first, and then my mother also now has a master's
Yes.
in counseling and substance abuse.
Yes.
But I was the first, I was the only. And I like this notion that you mentioned about, oftentimes people look at your chapter 10, they look at where you are today, but it denies and negates all the things you navigated chapter 1 through 9.
That's
Right.
right.
And so if you were just to take me today as a 7-figure CEO, you missed the times in which I was choosing between paying my light bill and buying a book for school.
Right.
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 You
Right.
miss all the opportunities or sacrifices that were made, or me having to file bankruptcy at 19
Yeah.
because someone stole my identity, right?
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
the costs that you pay of being poor and of being the first, the
Yeah.
mistakes that you make. I know that I have a disproportionate amount of student loan debt because there was no one who went before me that could help me, right?
Right.
That knew the things that I didn't know, because there's a cost that you pay based on what you don't know. We pay this in business, you pay it in life.
That's right.
And that's one of the costs that you inherit being the first to disrupt.
Yeah.
And so disrupting the poverty, the transmission of poverty in my family, the first to do that. And really what that means is, my kids, I think, are the first and the only to have a fully funded college fund.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We in no way are living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
Last year was the first year that I could say, if I didn't work the rest of the year, all of our bills were paid.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I may be the only person in my family who is 100% commercial debt free.
Yeah. Yeah.
In any generation, those are the disruptions. But the trauma disruption is the one that I hold most dear, is because I had to unlearn the things that the ways in which I was parented. I
Yeah.
had to unparent myself so that I didn't reinforce some of those beliefs and parenting styles and disciplinary practices, even, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To my children. That also meant I had to do my work on myself in the gap between what I received and what I needed, so that I didn't overcompensate with my kids. Because
That's right.
that's the way that I started off with my daughter was, I had swung the pendulum all the way in the other direction, that I wasn't giving her normal life experiences because I didn't know what they looked
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was adultified. I had, a job before I was 15. I homeschooled myself, right? There was a lot of things that I navigated to survive that these kids won't have to do. They get to thrive.
Yes.
And so I think it's important to understand where we've been, because oftentimes we say where we start does not impact where we go. But for me, I became who I needed. So where I started directly impacted where God put me. So
Yeah.
I can relate
Yeah.
as directly to folks in Fortune 500 CEOs,
Yeah.
right? As I can to guys still on the block making ends meet for their family in ways that may not be pro-social.
Right. Right. Right.
I'm comfortable in either situation because I've been in both,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's important because I have a platform and a responsibility to advocate for those who are still trying to survive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And so that's my why. Right.
Yeah.
And I talk about in chapter 10 of my book, I talk about the cost of making it, because we only really talk about what happens once we get there. We don't talk about all the losses, physical and symbolic, that we navigate on the way there, right?
Yeah.
Ability to disrupting, to thriving. In many ways, I lost a sense of home because I could no longer relate to my family members who are still where they were.
Yeah.
And I left, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think those have been important parts of my journey.
Yeah. That last part is super interesting and important too. All of it, right? I know you saw me like leaning in, that's why I love watching you speak, because I'm always like, oh, and even many of the counselors on my team is like, have you heard about Dr. Robinson such and such, right? I think you did something recently with NBCC too, and they were like all excited. And I was like, I love her. I love how she speaks, and I get really engaged as well. I had a conversation with my cousins. I'm originally from Los Angeles, And most of my family is still out there. And like you mentioned, the life that I live now is different from the life of my childhood and subsequently different from some of my family members' lives as well. And for the longest time, I was holding on to how do I keep it real, right? How do I make sure that my family doesn't feel that I've abandoned them or that I've changed, right? Because that's the worst thing when you grow up in poverty and somebody makes it out. It's this idea of, oh, they changed, they're brand new, right? Like they forgot where they came from, and I didn't want that label placed on me. But I had an interesting conversation with my cousins recently, and this is probably the second one that they had. And they were like, girl, if you don't just let that go, like we already know who you are, and we saw this for you before you even saw it for you. So we have been prepared for this far before you were prepared for this. And we're just excited to cheer you on and to continue to call you our cousin and to know that we have access to you still. So you don't have to do certain things to keep it real. Just be you. And that was so liberating to hear from them, because that's one of the costs of success, right? Like you
Yes.
are blazing that trail. So you are the one getting the bruises and the scrapes and falling into the pits and having to pull yourself up and not having anybody to follow and having those dark days, right? Because there's no light in front of you. You
That's
have
right.
to create that light with your God and your ancestors. So again, so much more that we continue to relate to. Let's go into this book, girl. You know, I love that book. I think as soon as it came out, I was like, ding, ding, let me get this in my Amazon cart, right? And in my offices. It's not stuck in my Amazon cart, guys, in case you guys are wondering. It is not. But talk to us about your book. Tell me about your book.
Yeah, so The Gift of Grief, I wrote actually, it wasn't the book I was trying to write. I had paid a book coach and, I had 6 months of weekly coaching, and the cost of making it, which is the final chapter, was the book I thought I was writing. And of course,
Okay.
God said, that is not what I called you to do in this version and this place in your life.
Right.
And it's interesting because I wrote the entire outline of the book as I was sitting bedside as my grandfather was
Yeah.
dying. And it's interesting because the thing that, and the way that the book got its title was, in the midst of my grief, I was able to recognize the gift in what was and what
Yeah.
still is.
Yeah.
And as I'm sitting there, and I'm the one who has the power of attorney and his advance directive, so I'm responsible for making these decisions. And because I'm a grief therapist, I remember in my master's program, I had to write an advance directive.
Yeah.
I had to also write my own obituary. And so I remember coming back home and telling my grandparents, you guys need to have your documents in order,
Right.
and forcing them to get paperwork in order.
Right.
What I didn't realize was that they had both chosen me as their power of attorney. And this was at least 10 years before, right? And they renewed it, and he updated his advance directive about 2 years ago, 2 years prior to actually needing it, right?
Right.
And recognizing that he didn't want any artificial breathing treatments or things like that, right, on it, which was something that wasn't on the original. And we had a conversation making sure I knew this. This became relevant because as I'm sitting there listening to him breathe,
Right.
as he's intubated, one of the things that he said to me right before they intubated him was, you remember what I asked you? And I said, yes, I remember, right? Which was to not allow him, if he could not come back home and take care of his wife in a close to similar manner in which he was before, to let him go.
Right.
And I said, yes, I remember. And he said, you remember no surgeries? And I said, yes, I know. Because we had had all the conversations, not only about the way in which he wanted to die, but I also didn't have anything personally that I hadn't shared with him that I needed to say.
Yeah.
There was a gift there in the midst of my grief, that there was nothing left undone.
Yes.
I knew he'd always tell me since I was a little bitty girl that there's nowhere that you can go that I won't come and get you.
Yeah.
And it was that type of covering that gave me permission to take my 2.5-year-old and leave St. Louis, the only place I'd ever lived.
Yeah.
5 minutes. Listen, I could see my grandparents' house if I leaned out my door far enough. I could see that's how close to home I lived, even as an adult, right?
Okay.
I had never lived more than 5 minutes away from my grandparents.
Yeah.
And I moved my 2.5-year-old clear to DC because I knew that if anything happened, he'd come for me.
Yes.
Right? That
Yes.
was the level of stability and safety. And there was a gift there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't in the losing him. It was that in the midst of grief, I had all of this certainty in love and stability. And I
Yeah.
didn't have the thoughts of I should have, or I
Yeah.
wish I would have, because we lived on purpose and loved out loud every single day.
Yeah.
And some of us don't have that experience. And so what I teach people to do in the gift of grief is to figure out how to claim that in the aftermath. Because
Yeah.
that is an aftermath, right?
Yeah.
And us being able to, the beautiful thing about grief, not the loss itself, is that it often reorients us to what actually matters.
Yeah.
Right? After my grandfather died, and one of the last things that he said to me at the very end was, "You have done enough and you don't owe anyone anything."
Yeah.
That was important as a disruptor. I know that they made so many sacrifices. People in my extended family made sacrifices so that I could be Dr.
Yeah.
Whether they actually believed I could do it, or they were just doing what they needed to do because my grandmother, the matriarch, asked them to. Either way, they did what they needed to do so that I could be who I was called to be, right? And so I had spent most of my adult life trying to repay that debt that my grandfather gave me permission to let go of.
That's right. That's
And it
right.
is in that permission that the true gift, right? I was able to leave and let that burden of not being enough, not having given enough, feeling guilty for making it.
Yeah, girl. Yeah.
Feeling guilty for being whole.
Yeah.
And claiming abundance, right?
Yeah.
I released that when he died because he gave me permission to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I took the lessons that I've learned as a grief therapist and the lessons that I've learned by sitting under the table in my grandma's kitchen, listening to them tell stories and, listen when they were having the parties and things I wasn't supposed to hear. And I put all of those things together and in a very accessible way. For people who don't have masters and PhDs, that may have a third grade education like my grandmother, can identify their losses and name them. Right. That they can access healing whether they come to therapy or not. And so that the gift of grief is a testament to healing being accessible and that it being our birthright. Yeah. And so that's what I did in that book. And so I feel good about that.
Yeah, feel good. I love it. I love it. Absolutely. I want the folks to know. So are you saying that the book is for anyone? They don't have to be in therapy. They don't have to be a therapist. They don't even have to know a therapist. They can pick up your book. I think you sell in many places, right? I know Amazon for sure. They can order it. They can have it delivered in 2 days with Prime. You know what? Let me not talk about no Prime because I'm not sponsored. Anyway, okay, let me move on. So they can get it in their cart. They can get it home and they can use it completely independently.
They can. Absolutely. Okay. It also comes with a course companion, a video course companion. So at the back of each chapter, there's a QR code and a link that I built a course alongside it because, there are some things that you may be introduced to for the first time. So in the book, I talk about in chapter 1, I introduce you to symbolic and physical losses. Most of us are familiar with physical losses when someone dies, but most of us aren't aware that there's symbolic losses that are the non-tangibles, right? The intangibles, like loss of safety and stability and identity and income, right? Those things that came to roost during COVID. These are the things that we actually experience on a day-to-day basis, even when something good happens, right? So you get a good job. And you go from knowing your thing and being in your zone of genius to being the new kid on the block, right? And trying to figure those things out. The ways in which we toggle spaces as the only, whatever the only means, is a loss, right? Because we are wrapping ourselves, we're trying to figure out what armor I need on today, right? That the loss of being unencumbered is one that we encounter and we float in and out of. And so we talk a little bit about those things. And so naming our grief is so important to being able to heal from our grief, right? So understanding those. The way that I wrote the book is that really, if you read chapter 1, then you can skip to any other chapter. They're written independently because I know folks don't read things cover to cover. You might hop right to the section on, how is social media impacting my grief? Both positively and negatively. You might skip to the chapter because you're trying to understand how grief is impacting a child in your life.
Yeah.
Because children are not many adults when it comes to grief. We say
That's
it all
right.
the time. We miss them so much as grievers, especially because November is National Child Grief Awareness Month. This is important because they often are coded as having behavioral issues or even
Right.
ADHD. One
Right.
thing that I tell people that usually blows their mind is, I'm like, fun fact, did you know that unresolved grief can show up as memory loss,
Yeah.
loss of
Yeah.
concentration, right? Which sometimes gets captured as ADHD and in elderly as early signs of dementia when
Right.
they're actually grieving, right?
Yes.
So many of their friends have died or they're no longer independent. They're grieving symbolic losses and we don't catch it because no one died, right?
Exactly.
But this book is really for anyone because none of us are exempt from grief, right?
That's
From
right.
death and dying, from the symbolic losses. And even if we don't feel like we're personally experiencing grief, every one of us knows someone who is.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And so I talk a lot about some of the myths as well as some of the grief etiquette. And I know I always step on toes, Dr. P, every time I talk about grief etiquette, because some of us in the faith world say things well intentioned that are so dishonoring, right? One
Yeah.
of the big ones that people kept saying to me, not only when my grandfather died, but my oldest brother and best friend died 9 months almost to the day,
Right. Mm.
was that they're no longer suffering.
Right.
And I'm like, at some point that might be comforting, but while I'm grieving, it isn't, because guess who is suffering? Me.
Exactly.
Guess who
Exactly.
actually just wants my person back? Me.
Yes.
It,
Yeah.
it cues me that whatever my physical or emotional expression is, shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And so what do people do is we get it together. And
Yeah.
when you ask me how I'm doing, I'm going to tell you I'm fine because you keep reinforcing that they wouldn't want me to be sad, right?
Yeah.
Which is dishonoring, right?
Right.
That I thought you'd be better by now, which puts a time limit on grief.
Or you're a therapist. Are you using your own tips and techniques?
Right.
Child, I'm a human first, right? I'm
First.
trained as a therapist. That is
That's
my
right.
education and my work. But I know exactly what you mean. You remember earlier this year, I lost my brother, and it was tragic. I was not ready, right?
Yeah.
I was like, what does this mean? And it goes into that the symbolic grief, because although I lost him physically, there was also the loss of the dreams that I had for our future, right? Because he's younger than me, and
Yes.
he has this niece and this nephew, and all of that kind of stuff, and the dreams that I had for us, and the dreams that I had for our family, and the dreams piece is important for Black women too. We see it a lot in Onyx around Black women, not they're grieving because they have a loss of a dream that may have been taken away from them, or that just didn't pan out the way that they thought, whether it was they wanted to be married by a certain age or have children, right?
Yes.
Like, you are grieving that. Whether it is, you wanted a promotion and you got denied because of your race or your gender, and they called it something else, you are grieving that.
That's right.
And instead we express it sometimes as anger, because that's what has been socially appropriate, especially for us as Black women. That's why they got this label and title for us, right? Angry Black women. But we are grieving so many areas of our life and not calling it that, and subsequently trying to handle it in different ways. So another reason that I absolutely love your book, because it gives permission to call it what it is, right? You're not just sad. That is not just that sadness, right? It is the full loss of something, and that you have to rebuild yourself, or add on to yourself based off of what you have lost. So I love the idea that you talked about it in terms of new jobs. I think about it in terms of college. Many of us get to go to college, and we grieve that we are no longer in college,
Yes.
or we grieve that we don't have the life that we may have grown up with, because that was traditional or safe for us. Grieving the fact that we have to trailblaze, right?
Absolutely.
There's loss
Absolutely.
there
Yeah,
too.
that the gap, that sometimes it's grieving the gap in what we receive versus what we needed, right?
Right.
And many of us, I know this is certainly true for me and many of my clients, I often have to check with my girlfriends who didn't have the childhood experience that I had, because sometimes I don't recognize whether or not the things that my teenage daughter does is normal teenage daughter stuff, because I didn't have the luxury of being a kid, right? I didn't have that opportunity to make some of the mistakes and to not know, right? Or to not be super responsible and adultify, because that wasn't my walk. And so some of the things that she does, I'm like, is she messing with me? Or is this like this regular teenage stuff? And I don't have a lens for it, right? So I check in with my friends who don't have my childhood trauma history. And they're like, no, like that's pretty. I'm like, all right, because it was going to be a different situation if she's just messing with me, right? But it's that also that not knowing, right? One of the things that I've been talking a lot with kind of normalizing, because we do not talk about the losses that occur when you become a parent. We only talk about all the joy, and I love them, and right. I know. Listen, I always step on toes. That's why I keep my good, nice shoes on. Okay, because if I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do it in style. But there's a losing of yourself, right? There is a losing of your identity, whether it's becoming a parent, becoming a partner or a spouse, right? Just being a successful Black woman. I remember when I got my PhD, my family of origin was afraid that I would not get married, because having a PhD meant that I was going to have too much to say. But that's really code for I won't be a submissive wife.
That's right.
I made myself undateable. That coincided with not only my education, but also my income. And listen, let me tell you something, because Jesus made a lot of them folks, okay? Because he sent me somebody that can handle all of this extra, okay? Amen. Okay, amen. But that is so important, because we never talk about the ways that we lose ourselves, not only in those roles, but in this whole notion of we've always had to work harder, and we internalize our worth, our work, and our worth being a part of our labor. And so we don't actually know how to just be still without doing, right? Because it's been hyperproductivity becomes a part of our trauma response and a part of our identity, that unpacking and being on the receiving end is hard to hold, right? And so I think that's really where some of our more symbolic losses are cumulative and generational, because some of this we get trained that this is how we're supposed to do from the previous generations. And where do we disrupt that, right? In my family, me saying my husband does most of the cooking, they're looking like, now, he was raised, but I was like, yes, and it don't work for my household.
That's right. We have a similar conversation over here too, because people like to put Megs and I in gender roles, even though we are the same gender, right? So we have to consistently push back in terms of let us just be us. Don't look at this outer appearance and think that you know everything. One of the interesting things that just came to mind while you were speaking was, I identify as bisexual. And I remember going through a period of grief after I came out, because I was not going to be with men, and not grieving the man per se, but grieving the structure, right? Like grieving what was expected, because I was about to go into a new realm. And being bisexual isn't just about who you end up sleeping with, right? It's about all of yourself and your identity and who you are and the connections. And so wondering, were there other parts of me that were going to also shift because I came out? And I remember that being like a really interesting period, and really needing to process that in a lot of different and spiritual ways. A lot of people think that because we're in the LGBTQ community that we don't have a connection with God, because the Bible makes it seem as if this is a sin, but we still have our connections with God, and still definitely have our spirituality, and still go to church and all those things. And I remember processing it spiritually as well, like who will I be in the midst of this grief, and the reimagining and the redefinition of who I am. And I like who I am. I think I'm pretty cool. I like him.
That's right. And that piece is on the other side of that, is the gift, right? Is that we get to reimagine what this next leg of the journey after loss. And I say after loss loosely, because the grieving process is often lifelong, right?
Yeah.
And so in different stages of our life, different milestones, different anniversaries, different life events, we may re-grieve things that we
That's right.
previously grieved and came to a place of peace or acceptance around. It doesn't mean that we won't revisit those, and that is natural and that is normal, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we feel like we haven't grieved well if we revisit losses, right? That we've already kind of touched. It is normal and natural. And so I just want to give folks permission, especially as we move into this holiday season, that there may be things that are present that create grief, and there may be things that are absent that also create the grief response or re-trigger the grief response. And I just ask that you be kind to yourself, that you're compassionate, that you acknowledge that you're grieving, right?
Yeah.
And that you're surrounded by people who will listen when you talk and will hear when you're silent.
Yeah. I have like all of these questions, right? And then we have like just a few minutes. So, girl, that just means that we about to be going out real soon. I think we got a date coming up anyway.
That's right. We gotta get it.
I got all of these questions. So, where I'm being led to kind of ask is this idea of grieving before the actual transition. So when you were talking about your grandpa, you were saying that you were already grieving in the hospital because you knew what was coming along, right? And you knew what was that you were about to experience this loss.
Yep.
I find that sometimes people they can foresee that a loss is about to come and they won't grieve. They go into denial, or they justify it by saying, I want to just live in this moment. So I won't think about the grief because I want to just live here. From your position as a grief therapist, as an author who has written this book, what are your ideas and thoughts around grieving before the actual loss, before the actual event has occurred?
Yeah, so that's called anticipatory grief or anticipatory loss, right? So this happens when individuals are terminal. This happens when folks are on hospice or what have you. And so the amount of time,
or when you see the economy about to drop and you might lose your job, or you see that your relationship isn't working out and you know that you are about to break up.
100%, all of that. And so some of us are active, right, in our grief, right? And others can be more passive in our grief. And there's no wrong way to do it as long as you grieve, right? And so sometimes what hinders us is that we think that if we grieve in anticipation, we're ready. So when it actually happens, like we prepared for it. But the reality is when it does happen, the grief process, the finality of it starts the grief process again.
Right.
There may be some things that you're able to wrap your mind around, right? So when my grandfather was grieving or when my grandfather was dying, I recognized that in order to honor his advance directive, I had run out of options medically, right? But I'm a God girl. And so although I had to grieve that he tied my hands medically for interventions, right? Because he wouldn't agree to surgery. He wouldn't agree to any advanced treatments. So I knew that's what I was grieving, that, my brain is like, listen, I heard your diagnosis, but it's 2 other specialists down the street that may be able to, that may be able to do something else. But he already told me that he would not allow them to do another surgery, right? And he had cancer, his lower lung had collapsed. And he knew about it for months in advance, but he knew not to tell me because I'd had him in the hospital, right? Because I could talk you, look, an Eskimo into buying some ice. Do you hear me? And so he didn't tell me because he knew that he would likely disabandon his own beliefs in order to make me comfortable. And so he didn't tell me until we were at that point, and he knew then I would honor it. And so even in those moments, I was grieving the loss of medical options, but my faith had always said, and I asked him, I said, listen, I don't know whose prayer you were answering. It might be his, and he's tired and he's ready to go. But I need to pray with specificity that I'm asking for a supernatural healing and intervention, and I know you can do it. So either come through for your girl with what I'm asking for, or give me peace that you're honoring what he's asking for.
That's right.
That was my anticipatory grief process.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I wrote that chapter first.
Okay.
That was the piece that I felt most clear about. was that I could accept the way that he lived, which meant that I had to honor the way that he wanted to die, even if it isn't what I would have chosen. And that, I think, is the piece that was about there not being anything undone.
Yeah, right? That's right.
And I think this is the piece that even when we can anticipate it, those of us who are faith-based people, so I'm a God girl, and I had said, I accept whatever is going to happen. And what's interesting is my sister coded that as that I had given up. And I said, I haven't, because my faith wasn't in the doctors to begin with. My faith was always with God.
That's right.
And if we were on the same accord regarding him coming out of that hospital, he would have led me to find the doctor that could help us.
That's right.
That's the way that my faith works.
Right.
But that wasn't the situation we were dealing with. And so the anticipatory piece is that we know it's happening. And some of us, out of protecting ourselves, avoid the reality.
Right.
I want to normalize that as being a normal part of the grief process. It's the delay and denial. What becomes concerning is that after it has happened, we cannot stay in the denial phase.
Right.
Grief is a psychological wound.
Yes.
The body is geared towards survival. It cannot determine or distinguish between a physical wound and a psychological wound. It is going to send those lovely neurotransmitters towards that site to heal itself. What does that mean? Is that when you have those quiet moments at night, your subconscious kicks in and you think about all the things that you pushed away during the day, because the body is geared towards survival. It's trying to heal the things that don't make sense, that need repair.
That's right.
That is what happens with denial. It's the reason that when you are on the treadmill or in the gym or you take vacation, the things that are unaddressed show back up and you're like, now why would that come? Because the body is geared towards survival. It's going to do the work, right? So you might as well cooperate.
Might as well let it.
Terms.
Yes.
The real harm is that unresolved grief can metabolize as trauma.
That's right.
Right? Grief can be traumatic. And now we're dealing with a whole different set of things, right?
That's right.
The gap in functioning, the quality of life. Many people, if they reach this space of being complex grief, metabolizing into trauma, right? I call them first cousins, right? They're very closely related, right? Can destabilize your whole world.
That's right.
And the beautiful thing about grief work is that we can have the same loss and have a different journey. And so I just ask you to walk your path without evaluating or comparing how someone else is doing it.
Yeah.
Do what takes care of you and do it in your way. And so that's part of the reason of that I wrote this book, is to give folks some ways that they can navigate it and recognize what works for them. Because what worked for me and what worked for my sister, right? We have the same history, the same parents, the same grandparents, right? Grew up in the same house. Our grief responses are radically different.
That's right.
And I looked like I wasn't grieving because I had my checklist out. I'm a Virgo, right?
Hey, come on now, you know where we at. Yes.
Listen, I was out buying, I was like, oh, he need new underwear. Why does he need new underwear? Because listen, he gonna have new underwear, right?
Yes, he needs new underwear. Yes.
Right? I had the best casket. It's my final opportunity to dress him. And I dressed him every Sunday as a little girl. For me, I was in the honoring phase and she was still in the denial phase. Our journey looked very different.
That's right. That's right.
And that's okay. That's important that we don't wound one another further because of the way that we might be grieving, right?
You know what's coming up for me is the theme. The theme is to walk in your own journey, right? So in each area that I've asked you about, whether it's been business, it's been, this is my journey. This is my purpose. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And because you are so close and aware of that, it is why you don't feed into this idea of competition, right? Because it sounds, whenever people say it, it sounds like they're being cocky, but nobody can compete with me. This is my journey. And in your case, this is your journey. This is what you were supposed to be doing. And that's how you came out of business, right? Or that corporate kind of business and started your own, or how you have moved to DC, or, married your husband and such. Or even how you grieve. And I think that's important for me to highlight right now, because I see so many people caught up in this cycle of comparison. And as a spiritual person, I find it to be disrespectful to God and to the creators, because they put us here for our lane. And so although you see somebody else in somebody else's lane doing something that's wonderful and great, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is supposed to be what's happening in your lane. And people, and equally so, what is happening in your lane may be wonderful and great, and you have to deal with the fact that people are comparing, are competing with you, right? But be grounded in the idea that, again, this cliche, what is for you. And as long as you are in purpose, you are going to get what you are supposed to have, and then experience that peace that comes along with it. We are,
that is so
go
sorry.
ahead, go ahead.
And I know we're over time. I think that is so critical in so many ways, because the thing that we don't account for is that the success that you are observing someone else experience came at a cost, right? But it's likely a cost that aligns with their overall life. It's a sacrifice that I incur walking in my lane. I didn't want to be a disruptor, right?
Right.
I've lost friends and family doing the thing that I was called to do, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And so their cost may not be one that you're even willing to carry. It may not be a burden you can physically or emotionally carry. And so I think it's so important that you embrace the thing that you were called to do, and to remember that there's more than enough, right?
Yeah.
There's more than enough.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know how much I love you. I am sad that we have to leave right now. But let folks know how to get in contact with you. How do they reach out? How do they hear from you? How do they buy your book? How do they, follow the amazing things that you're doing to disrupt the stigmas around mental health and disrupt the perception of what grief is and what it is not?
Absolutely. And so I'm Dr. Ajita Robinson on all platforms. I'm Miss Ajita on Twitter, but Dr. Ajita Robinson on all other platforms. My website is ajitarobinson.com. And if you go ajitarobinson.com/book, you'll find my book there. And pretty much everything else I have going on hangs out on that website. But those are the places that are most easy to kind of connect with me. And I talk back. Some people are like, I don't know. I know this is not going to get to Dr. Robinson. I answer my own emails.
I know that's right.
So I love to stay connected on purpose.
Always, always. And for therapy purposes, how do people get in contact with you?
So they would go to fit-counseling.com. That's for all therapy related services. We are only able to serve folks in the Maryland and DC area because of licensure purposes, but we'd be happy, and we accept insurance. And so that's where we do that magic.
That's right. That's right. I appreciate you so, so much. So thank you for coming and spending this time with me today. And for everybody who had a chance to listen, either listening live or listening a little bit later, I hope that you receive this message as a gift, right? It is not by happenstance that you happen to be able to listen to this today. It is likely directed by the universe, and is likely directed that there was something that you needed to hear today to either bring you back to purpose or to continue to support and validate your purpose as well. As a person who has experienced a lot of grief this year, starting earlier this year with my brother, I absolutely 100% feel like I learned a lot today, feel connected with a lot of the messages that were heard, and I hope you feel that same way too. So thank you for coming and spilling the tea with Dr. P. Of course, you can find me on Instagram at Onyx Therapy Group, or Mahogany Sunshine, on Facebook as Onyx Therapy Group, or Linnell Plummer, and LinkedIn, Onyx Therapy Group and Linnell Plummer. So I hope to hear from you all soon, and definitely reach out to Dr. Robinson if you have any other thoughts or questions, especially as we are going into this holiday season. And that is sometimes when physical and symbolic grief shows up too. So reach out and get the support and the guidance, and pick up that book. It is an amazing book, so make sure you pick it up as well. Thank you so much, and I will see y'all next month. And Dr. Robinson, I'm gonna see you soon. So, okay.
Right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.